esta octava sesión del Seminario de Derecho y Sociedad organizado por el Colegio de México y el Colegio Nacional. Esta sesión la vamos a dedicar al tema de el cambio tecnológico y el derecho, y en específico a las relaciones entre el trabajo y la automatización y la inteligencia artificial. Como nuestro ponente de hoy va a hacer su presentación en inglés, ahora voy a hacer el cambio a inglés, pero quiero recordarles que en cualquier momento pueden hacer sus preguntas en español mediante la opción de preguntas y respuestas o el chat de Zoom, o mediante la opción del chat de YouTube. Pueden hacerlo en español perfectamente y nosotros podemos encargarnos de traducirlas al inglés. Y entonces, bueno, ahora voy a cambiar a inglés. So, welcome to the A session of the Seminar on Law and Society, co-organized by El Colegio de México and El Colegio Nacional. This session of the seminar was especially organized with El Colegio de México's Center for Economic Studies in mind. And this is the reason why it is devoted to a pressing issue in the field of economics and society today. This issue is the question of the future of work, especially in relation to technological developments such as artificial intelligence and automation. Some of the main debates in economics and society are related to these questions. So, for example, the discussion of whether technological changes will mean the end of work as we have known it, at least since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, or also whether this end, if this is so, will also mean a radical transformation of society, a society that has been structured precisely around this idea of salaried work, of wage work, and of an economy that counts labor as one of its main factors of production. But one of the questions that we want to address today is whether this is truly the case in the decades to come, and if so, in what sense and to what extent. And also, what should be the most appropriate responses, perhaps, to the social and political horizons that these changes might entail. So that's why we're very honored to have in today's session the participation of Aaron Benanav, who has recently published Automation and the Future of Work, his first book and precisely one of the most important contemporary contributions to these debates on automation and work. Dr. Benanav is an economic historian and a social theorist. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin. He holds a PhD in history from the University of California, LA, and his research interests include global economic history, economic development, labor market dynamics, unemployment, and inequality. And to discuss Dr. Benanav's presentation, we're very happy to have the participation of Professor Laura Juarez. Professor Juarez holds a PhD in economics from the University of Texas at Austin, and is an assistant professor at El Colegio de México's Center of Economic Studies. Her research has focused on diverse aspects of Mexico's labor market, as well as the effects of non-contributive retirement programs on households' economic decisions. Her work has been published in several international journals, such as the Journal of Public Economics and the World Bank Economic Review. And so for this session, we will follow the following format. First, Aaron will present us his exposition. Then we'll have Laura's comment on Aaron's presentation. And then we'll devote the rest of the time to questions from the audience. So as I mentioned to you earlier in Spanish, we encourage you to send us your questions using the chat features on the video platforms, either Zoom or YouTube. And of course, if you prefer, you can write your questions in Spanish and we can translate it into English for our panelists. So now I give the floor to Aaron.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at El Colegio de México. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. And I should say also that my book is coming out in Spanish, I think later this year. So maybe, you know, I'll send a link when that when it's time. So I'm just going to bring up my presentation here, and I'll just walk you through the content. So my presentation today is called Artificial Intelligence and Future of Work, Autonomous Systems, Law, Work, and Technological Change. The starting point for the talk, as well as for the book that I wrote, is a group of automation theorists who became very popular in the last 10 years, who claim that we're living in an era of accelerating technological change. You know, some examples of the books there. These authors argue that jobs are being destroyed at such a rapid pace that the labor market is unable to recover. And the question that I'm going to talk about here, as well as the animating question in my book, Automation and the Future of Work, is this the end of work? Are we seeing the end of work? Or in other words, is automation responsible for the growing difficulty that many workers face in finding or holding on to jobs? And of course, you know, that's been made much worse this past year during the coronavirus pandemic, but it was even bad before that, as I hope to show you. So the argument that I'm going to make today is that these automation theorists are actually wrong. Their explanation is false for what's going on in society. I'm going to argue that the pace of technological change only appears to be speeding up. In reality, the problem that's really suffusing the economy is that growth rates, economic growth rates, have been really slowing down. And it's this slowdown in economic growth. It's really the fact that the economy is not creating jobs very quickly, not that they are being destroyed very quickly. That's the key to explaining the troubles that workers face. And that in turn is going to provide the key backdrop to the expansion of insecure work in the emergent digital economy. So I'm just going to take you briefly through some background on the new technologies and some labor market dynamics, talk about some theoretical approaches to the problem, say something very briefly about the cases and sources I use, and then I'm going to talk about really automation and stagnation in manufacturing, and then from there to the wider economy, and say a little bit about labor markets and legal frameworks at the end. So first, just some background. There's a number of technologies that people have really focused on in this era to explain what's going on in the labor market. First, advanced industrial robotics. This is an image of the Tesla production plant in Fremont, California, where they are pushing out towards lights out production. So they're trying to advance towards a factory that can run in the dark because it has no human beings involved. And of course, part of what's driving robotics and is making it seem possible to advance robotics to a new age is a corresponding set of technological developments, artificial intelligence, and one form of that in particular, a narrow form of artificial intelligence called machine learning, deep learning, and neural networks, which I'd be happy to talk about in more detail. One thing that the authors who present these theses about automation, they don't talk about as much is the platform economy, where there are, of course, a lot of people working in a digital economy, although companies like Uber and Lyft are claiming that eventually the cars that ferry people around will be fully automated and they won't have any more drivers working for them. Now, as these technologies have been coming online, here I'm going to talk about the US labor market, but it would be interesting to give examples from other countries. While these technologies have been coming online, the US economy has been beset by what are called jobless recoveries. And what that means, what's depicted in this graph here, is that after each recession, you get the number of people working declines, and then it takes longer and longer for the labor market to recover. So, unemployment rates will reach, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, even now 15%. And then it will take longer and longer number of months for the economy to reabsorb the workers who've lost their jobs. But it's not only a story about persistent unemployment. It's also a story about underemployment. So people talk about that in a number of different ways. We can look at underemployment in terms of people having fewer hours of work, having more insecure work. A very common way of looking at it is to look at inequality in the labor market and to look at the wages productivity gap. There's a very famous depiction of this from the Economic Policy Institute for America that shows that wages in the US have really stagnated since the 1970s for production workers and non-supervisory workers, while productivity continued to grow. This is a graph for all OECD countries, although I don't think it includes Mexico. But it shows the divergence across all the OECD countries, where productivity has been growing faster than wages, than average wages, and even that faster than median wages. And the result of this is this famous decline that people talk about in the labor share of income, the share of all of the income in society that goes to workers as wages and salary payments, as opposed to going to capital. So the question that people are asking is, are these technological innovations and labor market trends connected? Are the emergent digital technologies like automation technologies and artificial intelligence the cause of these deeper labor market trends in the American or OECD economies? And this new automation discourse, what I call the automation discourse, has answered this question affirmatively. So texts like The Second Machine Age by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, Martin Ford, The Rise of the Robots. You have people in trade unions or former trade union executives like Andy Stern also talking about this. Futurists like Daniel Susskind at Oxford, A World Without Work, and even people on the very far left like Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams, or Aaron Bastani talking about fully automated luxury communism being an emergent possibility for our future. And undergirding this, like thinking about how should we think about this question? Is this what's really going on? One way to approach it would be as a kind of pure technology story. And then what we would do is we would just look at the technology and see, is this what's really happening? Are the technologies that are emerging today tending to improve workers' labor productivity? That would be like labor augmenting technologies like the assembly line, in an earlier era. Or are the technologies we have today automating? Are they tending to substitute for human labor? And we could kind of imagine all technologies being arrayed on a line between more augmenting and more automating in character. And there have been a number of studies about this. The most famous one that people usually refer to is the so-called Oxford-Martin study, originally released in 2013, but only published in 2017, which said, without exactly saying when, but they said that 47% of jobs today are at some point in the future going to disappear due to automation, which would be quite a lot. The OECD reran the numbers and said, in reality, it seemed likely that only 14% of jobs are really at a high risk of automation. The remaining jobs Oxford Martin identified are probably going to be partially automated. So there's still going to be work, but people will be working with these new digital technologies rather than being replaced by them. And what the OECD said has been confirmed by other more recent studies like MIT and so on. Now, while this emergent discourse about automation has been going on and it's been sort of called into question by these studies, there's a whole other school of thought thinking about the digital economy, researchers who have really cast doubt on this pure technology approach. We've seen texts like Uberland by Alex Rosenblatt, sort of looking at how are these technologies actually being implemented into work and finding that they're being implemented in ways that don't get rid of workers, but actually, surveil them. Algorithmic management is a concept people are often talking about here. The use of computers to really keep track of workers, to kind of intensify their work. Books like Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri have examined all of the hidden labor behind apparently automated processes. So, when you're using Facebook, it looks like everything is just happening automatically. But in fact, there's many workers working as content moderators who are looking at all these horrible images that people are posting and deciding whether they should be there or not. So there's a lot of hidden labor behind apparently automated processes. And that would allow us to kind of in a sociological way, kind of add a dimension, a social dimension to the economic or technological story, to think about how these technologies are actually being implemented in work. And there's a whole history of sociologists, kind of like those studies I just mentioned, looking at the ways that these technologies are either making for very alienated work or are perhaps giving workers more autonomy in their work, where autonomy is generally defined as self-directed work that allows workers to use their skills, that gives them a feeling of purpose. And a lot of studies suggest that workers' autonomy in turn relates to their bargaining power. The more bargaining power workers have, the more they're able to affect the ways that technologies are being implemented in the work process. And so, of course, a lot of these studies are showing that the technologies we have today are really being implemented in this area of the chart I've given you, that a lot of the technologies seem to be implemented in ways that are in fact not freeing of workers in the way the automation discourse says, but are really producing poor quality, precarious work and are part of that transformation. So my account is to say that there's really a missing variable between the automation story that the kind of pure automation theorists are telling and the critical discourse that's arisen around automation that says, look, actually, these technologies are just creating poor quality work. And that is the macroeconomic context in which these digital technologies are actually being implemented in production. So one way to think about this missing macroeconomic context is just to think about the way that as the unemployment rate rises and falls, it affects workers' bargaining power. So this is just a graph of the inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and wage growth. And you just see that when unemployment rates are high, American workers, they don't see very much wage growth. Their bargaining power is reduced and they're able to push for less wage increases. Whereas when unemployment falls, workers have stronger bargaining power in a tight labor market, and they're able to push for correspondingly higher wages. And then we could kind of imagine that there's this like cyclical phenomenon where, when there's booming economies, workers have a lot more power to affect the way technologies are implemented. Whereas when there's weak labor markets, workers have less power to do that. What's missing from this chart, which is the real object of my story here, is this process that economists have been calling secular stagnation. It's not just that workers do better when the economy is growing quickly and labor markets are tight. It's that that boom period has become weaker and weaker over time, and OECD countries' economies are growing at a slower and slower pace over time. So this chart, that trend line, shows in the OECD, it declined from growth rates of about 5% on average in the 1960s to a little bit more than 1.5% per year in the recent period. And that trend line doesn't even include this massive crisis of 2020, the Corona crisis. So what I'm going to argue, or what I am arguing in my book, is that it's this slowing growth, this pattern of stagnation that I just showed you, not accelerating technological change, that's really the cause of the low demand for labor in the economy. So this is affecting, this low labor demand encourages, this is the context that's encouraging the digital economy to develop in ways that are alienating for workers. Employers are a lot less likely to take workers' perspectives into account when making investment decisions if those workers are generally insecure and kind of weak in their position facing their bosses. So I'm going to show this by looking more closely at the economy, and there's a little bit of, specific little charts I have to show you, but hopefully it'll be clear even for those who are not so economically minded. But where I start in my account is with manufacturing, and there's a few reasons for that. So I'm going to talk here about what's wrong with the automation discourse and why it doesn't really explain the trends. So there's a few reasons to start with manufacturing. One is that it's very easy to measure how many robots are being implemented in manufacturing. And I'm going to focus here mostly on Japan, Germany, and the United States, which are some of the most roboticized countries in the world. But note that Japan and Germany are way out ahead of the United States. Japan and Germany, like South Korea, And in fact, Sweden and Denmark, those are much more roboticized manufacturing sectors than the United States. Another reason to look at manufacturing is because in the accounts that the automation theorists give, they talk about manufacturing because there the jobs apocalypse has already taken place. We've seen in country after country, deindustrialization has set in waves across all of these different countries, and even less developed countries, so-called lower and middle income countries, have seen deindustrialization happen at lower levels of income than was the case in the richer countries. And of course, that's true not only in the countries like the US and Japan and Germany and the UK, but also in Mexico, in fact, as well, which has been deindustrializing since about 1985. And even China, which was this real industrial powerhouse for a few years there, between 2003 and 2013, even China has been deindustrializing. And according to the UN, the entire world is deindustrializing. So this is something that the automation theorists will often point to. This has already happened in manufacturing, and then it's going to happen as well in services. Now, I'm going to show you what's really going on in the manufacturing sector and why the automation story is not a very good explanation of what's going on. In order to understand what I'm going to say, you just have to understand, maybe a review for you, 3 basic concepts from economic accounting. One is just output. It's just like the volume of production measured in terms of real value added. It's just how much in volume terms is being produced in the manufacturing sector. I'm going to talk about employment, which is just how many workers are working in manufacturing, and productivity, which is just a measure of output per worker in this case. So it's just the total amount of output divided by the number of workers. And there's a kind of standard relationship between these terms. It's actually on the very first page of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He says, what determines the wealth of a nation? What determines the size of its economy, the rate of growth of output? Well, 2 things. It's the rate of growth of employment plus the rate of growth of productivity. So and I'll show you a little bit more what I mean there. So let's take just some representative examples. These are just completely fake examples that I made up to kind of show you how these relationships work. So imagine we have a car factory, and this car factory is producing 3% more cars per year. But the productivity of the workers is totally stagnant. There's no productivity growth, no technological change at all. Well, in order to produce 3% more cars, you would need 3% more workers to make those cars if the technology hadn't changed. So 3% output growth minus 0% productivity growth equals 3% employment growth. Just flipping around the relationship I showed you before. Similarly, if you have this car factory where output's growing at 3% and productivity is growing at 3%, then you wouldn't need any additional workers to produce this additional output. You could produce 3% more cars every year, and if productivity is growing at 3% per year, you don't need to hire any additional workers to do it. Here's what those relationships look like in the actual United States economy in manufacturing. This is in the recent period from 2001 to 2017, which is when the statistics end. In reality, in the US, manufacturing, the volume of production in manufacturing has been growing at about 1% per year, and productivity has been growing at 3% per year. So 1 minus 3 is -2. That means that employment in manufacturing has been shrinking by 2% per year. And if you think about it, this is really one of the core ideas of the automation discourse. This is like Andrew Yang, who's probably going to be mayor of New York. This is like his story about the world. He's just saying, look, we're making more and more stuff with fewer and fewer workers because productivity is growing so quickly that we can make more things even as employment is shrinking in manufacturing. He says, this is what's going to happen to the whole economy. But if we zoom out and look at what's happening over time, we see a very different story. It's not, this is just the same information, but here the 1950s and 60s, then the mid 70s to 2000, and then the period I showed you before. What you can see is that it's not really that productivity is taking off in the recent period. Productivity is basically pretty flat in the US. Productivity growth in manufacturing is pretty flat. The real driving force here is that output growth is falling. The manufacturing sector has become more and more stagnant over time in terms of the rate at which the production is expanding is getting slower and slower and slower. And that's what's responsible for the decline in employment in manufacturing, not rising productivity growth, but falling output growth. And at least in the story I told you so far, it seems like productivity was at least, steady over time. But some economists like Susan Hausman, and I follow her here, have disputed these statistics and argue that actually manufacturing productivity in the US is much lower than the statistics make it appear. And the way she does that is that she breaks apart all the different pieces of the manufacturing sector. And she shows that in every part of manufacturing in the US, except computer and electronic products, we've seen a real sharp decline in productivity growth rates. And she says the reason why computers seem to be growing at 23% per year in terms of output and correspondingly more or less in productivity is that the US statisticians measure this productivity growth falsely. They treat the production of faster processors as if it were equivalent to producing more and more computer chips. But as anyone who has a computer knows, it's not really true, that relationship, that having a faster and faster chip is like having more and more computers or something like that. So what Susan Hausman shows is that if you exclude this one sector of manufacturing, computer and electronic products, then you see manufacturing productivity growth fall by 1.7% per year. So actually in the more recent period, output and productivity would be much worse in manufacturing. And even Paul Krugman recently in the New York Times pointed out that in the US, in manufacturing, during the era that was supposed to be the era of automation, productivity was zero in manufacturing for the entire 2010s. There was really no growth in productivity in manufacturing. And that actually brings the US more in line with its big competitors, countries like Germany and Japan. There too, you see not a stable level of productivity growth, but really falling productivity growth over time. And here too, the real story of why jobs are disappearing in manufacturing is that the rate of output growth in manufacturing has fallen really severely. It recovered a little bit recently in Germany, but in general, the trend has been towards much slower growth in manufacturing. I made the numbers for Mexico just to have the comparison there. And you can see a slightly different story in Mexico, in part because I think some of the manufacturing capacity in Mexico is actually informal, where people are working with very little machinery and equipment, and they're adding only labor, and they're working with very little equipment. So it brings down productivity growth rates. But you can see the general trend there of a very sharp, period by period decline in the rate of growth of output in Mexican manufacturing from the 50s, when it was 50s and 60s, it was very fast, and then it slows down more and more in the more recent periods. And productivity growth has basically been zero in Mexican manufacturing in aggregate, which is, I think, because there's highly productive, somewhat productive production in the export sector, and then many of these kinds of informal positions that have very low productivity levels. In any case, the overall story that I'm trying to tell is that it's not the pace of automation that's really speeding up. It's that rates of industrial expansion are slowing down. Why is that the case? Well, there's a number of different possible explanations, and I think it's a really difficult story to figure out. Four possibilities that are discussed in literature. One is the speed of technological change. That's the kind of automation story, which I've suggested is probably inaccurate. The other story is just an evolution of demand story, the idea that richer countries just spend less on manufacturing and more on services. One of the big problems for that story is that countries with very low levels of GDP per capita are seeing the same trends of deindustrialization, what Danny Roderick has called premature deindustrialization. So it's not following the demand story. A third one that I'm going to focus on here is the globalization and trade story not working out the way that economists said it would. And a fourth one, which is particularly important for countries like Mexico, but also around the world, is the demographic story. It's just a story in part about the fact that many people are aging into the labor market and they have to find work somewhere. So just to focus a little bit on a part of the story that's very important to me, the manufacturing story, economists really focused on this idea of globalization, that since the 1970s, we've seen exports rise as a share of GDP, and this is supposed to bring gains from trade. You know, more trade means everyone benefits, and countries are expected to specialize in particular goods and then all trade with one another. But in reality, and these are the numbers from the World Trade Organization, what we've seen is that this era of globalization actually saw, on the whole, a sharp slowdown in the global rate of growth of manufacturing output. So as globalization was really taking off, the speed of growth of industrial production was actually slowing down across the world. And what I say, in line with a few other people who've thought about this, is that globalization generated more trade redundancies than trade complementarities. Many countries were producing the same kinds of goods, and that meant industrial overcapacity in many lines, higher rates of competition, and lower rates of investment. And that basically is what was driving the slowdown in industrial output growth. Now, that's a really crucial story in my view, and it gives us a different take on the story about the transition from an industrial to a service-based economy, which is, of course, a very important story that a lot of people talk about. But what they often don't talk about is that this transition from a world with a very high rate of industrial growth to one where, you know, a service-based economy, is that this transition was associated with a productivity growth slowdown, an economic growth slowdown, and a persistently low demand for labor, so higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, and so on. And just to give you a very brief sense of this, during the heyday of, in the US, the heyday of the industrial economy, productivity growth in core industries was very fast, but that's the middle line, but output growth was even faster. So you had this very high rate of productivity growth and even faster rate of industrial output growth, generating constant employment growth in manufacturing. Today, these high productivity jobs in manufacturing are declining. Like, workers aren't being added to high productivity sectors. They're actually shifting out of high productivity sectors as deindustrialization sets in. By contrast, in services, today, output's growing at a slower pace before, but productivity growth is even slower than in the past. And what that means is that, and these are the growing jobs in the economy. So the economy is selecting these very low productivity growth jobs for steady employment expansion. And the result of that over time is that as we shift away from a manufacturing-based economy to a services one, productivity growth for the entire economy is slowing down significantly. And I added the corresponding numbers there for Mexico, where for the economy as a whole, according to the Conference Board International Statistics, we've seen a dramatic fall in rates of manufacturing productivity growth in Mexico, and overall productivity growth has fallen to almost zero, stagnation of productivity growth in Mexico. So a deeper version of the trend unfolding in the higher income countries. Meanwhile, in because productivity growth is a major component of overall economic growth, as productivity growth rates have fallen with this transition, we've seen a dramatic slowdown in the rates of growth of these economies. And similarly in Mexico, as manufacturing MVA is just the rate of growth of manufacturing output that I showed you before, as manufacturing has slowed down, the entire economy has slowed down. And much of the growth of output in Mexico in the past 20 years has really been due to the addition of labor rather than productivity growth. So I'll skip this point about Germany. The result of this stagnation trend in the economy Given that manufacturing growth engine is running down and we have a transition to services where productivity growth is very slow, we don't see the automation story unfolding there. In fact, in the whole economy, productivity growth has been lower than it's ever been. And in the decades that were supposed to be the decades of incredible technological change, we just don't see that in the numbers. The real story that's going on is a slowdown in the economy, the stagnation trend that's generating this persistently low demand for labor, higher unemployment rates, as well as underemployment rates in the recent period as compared to the past, but not due to technological change, really due to this slowdown in the growth rate. Now, of course, this general story that I've been telling of slowing growth and weaker labor markets doesn't affect all workers in the same way. In a slow-growing economy, workers in general face a low demand for their labor, but who and how is really affected by this differs due to legal and political structures. So in the United States, workers tend to be really legally unprotected. Workers can be hired and fired at will. Only unionized workers have protection from the general trends in the labor market. And that means that in the US, as unemployment rates have risen, that's affected all workers, and it's made all workers more insecure. And we've seen stagnation of wages happening for 80% of the labor market. In other rich countries like Japan and Germany, they have much stronger degrees of protection for permanent workers. And what that means is that if you have a full-time permanent job, it doesn't really matter as much what's happening in the labor market and how high unemployment is. It's really workers in the more contingent and temporarily employed sectors who are feeling the brunt of this overall low demand for labor. And of course, in global South countries and, thinking about the Mexican economy as well, you see this very sharp divide as well between workers who are on formal contracts with permanent employment, often having a much higher degree of protection, but that affecting a much smaller share of the workforce. And then you have a large informal sector where workers are really subject to the effects of what's going on in the labor market. So when the demand for labor is low and when unemployment rates are high, they're very much affected by that experience. So just to summarize, sorry, I've gone a little bit over time here. Is this the end of work? No. In reality, the pace of technologically induced job destruction is not speeding up. We aren't seeing technology generating higher and higher rates of labor productivity, as people like Andrew Yang would say. In reality, economic growth rates are slowing down, and that's reducing the rate at which new jobs are being created. That's really the key problem across these economies. And that affects the costs and benefits of firms' investment decisions. And that ends up creating an environment in which workers end up with very little say in how their digital work processes are structured. So that's more or less the kind of big story that I have for you today. The automation story is really interesting because it focuses our attention on this problem that there's so many workers who are having trouble finding work, that the economy has been beset by increasing insecurity and inequality, but they tell the story the wrong way because it's not really about technological speed up causing jobs to disappear. It's really a story about slowing economic growth, not creating enough jobs, and that being the source of a lot of the troubles in the economy. And in the book, I discuss the way that affects also how we think about solutions and possible solutions to those troubles. So, and I should also say the book has a lot more to say about the middle-income countries and low-income countries than the presentation, which really focused on some of the higher-income countries. So, but I'd be happy to talk about how to think about this in a global South context, because I think that's a really important part of the story. So thank you so much. Again, sorry I went a little over time there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron, for this great presentation that gives us a very good overview of your argument. Ahora quisiera recordar al público que pueden enviarnos sus preguntas en español o en inglés usando el chat de Zoom o el chat de YouTube. Now I give the floor to our discussant, Professor Laura Juárez.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I prepare some slides as well. You can see, right? Can you see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Humberto and Jose Ramon, who is not here, but thank you for inviting me to comment on artificial intelligence and automation. It's really, I mean, Aaron's presentation is very detailed. I'm just to make comments on specific issues. So the main points of his presentation, as I understood it, is that automation is not the main force behind the widespread deterioration of the labor market in several countries. Rather, automation is interacting or is aggravating a slowdown in economic growth, which is generating a low demand for labor. And he showed us a lot of data to support his story. And the second main point of his presentation is that in this context, work in the digital economy is expanding, right? And this type of work has some characteristics that are negative for workers. So regarding the first point, I just want to talk briefly about some labor market trends in Mexico. I mean, Aaron showed us some manufacturing data. I'm just going to talk about more general labor market trends. So in Mexico, for the first time in several decades, after the 2008 financial crisis, we also experienced a slow labor market recovery. Usually in the two previous crises in Mexico, employment, real wages would fall almost immediately after the shock, and then employment would go up, right? Would recover fast. And after the 2008 financial crisis, this did not happen. Unemployment was unusually persistent, I mean, unusually for Mexico. Before the crisis, unemployment was about 3 to 4%. After, it remained around 5% until 2014. And it finally reached pre-crisis levels until 2017. And again, still there's no explanation, at least on the part of the economic research about Mexico, about why this happened. There are several hypotheses, you know, wage rigidities combined with more general trends that Aaron talked about, etc. If we look at underemployment, if we look at underemployment followed a similar pattern in Mexico. So it was about 7% before 2008, and then it jumped after the crisis and stayed at a higher level between 2009 and 2015. Just 1 second, okay. Another point of his presentation regarding to the first point is wage growth and inequality. So Aaron told us that the impacts of slowing growth and automation vary by country and by skill, so the who and how that he talked about. So in the US, the impact of these two forces combined have affected mostly low-skilled workers in a disproportionate manner, and has increased inequality in the period from the 1980s to 2012. In Mexico, something different happened. After NAFTA, the return to education and experience decreased, but it did at the top of the wage distribution, particularly. So wage inequality was reduced, not because of strong growth at the bottom, but because of reduced growth at the top. And then this trend continued in the 2000s, no? In the first decade of the 2000s, there was moderate wage growth for low-skilled workers and basically wage stagnations for high-skilled workers. And these two forces combined led to modest reductions in wage inequality in that period. Finally, although automation might not be the primary force, it does eliminate certain types of jobs. So, for example, author says that so far those that have been easier to automate, called routine jobs, have been eliminated. No? And these are jobs that typically are in the middle of the skill distribution, right? And there's also some micro evidence that shows a negative impact of automation in Latin America. Automation has eliminated certain types of jobs, but has also complemented others. Again, following author, at least till now, automation has complemented those workers who are in jobs that are intensive in abstract tasks. Which are these tasks? Analysis, problem solving, creativity, intuition. And these are typically high skill workers in high skill and demanding jobs. Although automation in the future, so Humberto was asking us about the future, although automation is reaching into tasks and jobs that are also more abstract and analytical, in the short run, the acquisition and distribution of these skills matters for inequality. So one possible policy implication of this, at least for the short-term future or medium-term future, is that there has to be a shift in the kind of skills that we invest, no, or that we train workers with, so that they are more able to face at least the automation part of all this deteriorated labor environment. My second comment, and again, I'm really focusing on two aspects of the overall presentation, but I'm happy to discuss more when we have the questions of the public. The second point is about the digital economy and flexibility. So Aaron told us that in the digital economy is expanding, and this type of work has some detrimental features for workers, at least in the way that is being implemented now. So these jobs are insecure, income is highly variable, they have no fringe benefits, no employment protection, and the way it is organized right now, it erodes the bargaining power and the say of workers. And my point here is, however, even though I would not say this is not true, I mean, it is true, this type of work, I think, has also something that is of incredible value to some workers, which is flexibility. In general, I mean, even before the digital economy, the policy discussion has tended to focus on good jobs versus bad jobs, right? Good jobs are productive jobs, they are secure, they have decent wages, they provide fringe benefits. And by fringe benefits, I mean health insurance, retirement saving, among others. And then there are bad jobs, right? Low quality jobs that have low productivity, they are insecure, have low wages, and do not provide those benefits. And so we want more of the good jobs and we want less of the bad jobs. And that has been most of the, or at least part of the policy discussion has been around that. However, good jobs are not flexible. Jobs that have these characteristics that I just mentioned, that they are productive, high wage, secure, and that have fringe benefits, are not flexible. And schedule flexibility is highly valued by some workers. I'm not going to say that for everyone, but for some workers, it's highly valuable. There's some evidence, for example, for the US, for Uber drivers, that these drivers would have to be compensated with wages that are 50% higher, enabled to make them forego the flexibility in setting their work schedule, right? 50% is a lot, and obviously this depends on the sample of the study. Uber drivers self-select, at least in the US, right? Because probably they like flexibility. There's another work by Mas and Palais for the US too, in a broader sample, and they find that the average willingness to pay in terms of accepting a lower wage for a job that is flexible is low. So for the average worker, the willingness to pay in terms of a lower wage might not be very high, but there is a long right tail in the distribution. So that means that there's a significant proportion of workers that highly value flexibility. And then if we think that flexibility is like a luxury, right? There's also evidence for Colombia, Bustelo et al. 2020, they show that low-skilled women in Colombia, in Bogota, have a high willingness to pay for a flexible full-time job, so they are willing to receive a lower wage in order to have a full-time job that is flexible, and they are less willing to pay for a part-time job. So this means that women, at least these women, do want to work full-time, they just want higher flexibility regarding their schedules. Why is flexibility important? I mean, some workers might just have a preference for flexible work, right? Like academics, I mean, I love flexibility. So that's why I prefer academia to other types of jobs available to economists. But for other workers, particularly women, other types of work compete with market work. So in Mexico, in the first quarter of 2019, about 21% of people who were out of the labor force, so these are people who are not looking for a job, they are not working and they are not looking for a job, 20% of them report that they need and desire to work. So why are they not looking? 25% are not looking because they are completely devoted to housework. Another 18% are not looking even though they want and they need to work because they have no one to look after their children. And these two are not overlapping categories. So these two are excluding categories. So this means that together they amount to 43% of those people who want to work, but they are not looking for a job. And finally, regarding this point about good jobs and bad jobs, Aaron also talked about this dichotomy when he talked about Mexico. So there are a lot of low productivity informal jobs and then very few high productivity formal jobs, right? An alternative that I see to try to reduce this dichotomy, is to cut the link between labor force participation or the type of job that a worker has and protection against basic risks. So for example, provide universal insurance for universal risks, for example, life, health, and retirement, and then job-specific insurance only for job-specific risks, like workers' compensation, for example. And this proposal for Mexico is very detailed by Levy in his 2008 book. And Levy argues that doing this, like shifting the benefits, for example, or the insurance that we provide to individuals, shifting that insurance from being provided through their jobs to being provided universally would also help in cutting the link between financing those benefits through payroll taxes, and in that sense would contribute to creating more like high productivity jobs. And I think that would be on my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your comment. So we already have a couple of questions from the audience, but before proceeding to reading the questions, I don't know if Aaron would like to comment something on Laura's comment or respond.
Sure, yeah, I'll just be brief. And Laura, thank you so much for your comments. I also appreciate, a very common problem now in the Corona era of, having to do childcare and give presentations at the same time. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it. I would just point out, I guess, maybe just two very brief comments. One is that I think that the auteur story is a good example of some of the pitfalls to my thinking about how economists have approached the automation question, because, you know, isolating a set of variables to really focus in on what's happening and kind of missing the bigger picture. So one thing that auteur himself has noted is that in the US, the college wage premium, like the idea that this is affecting low wage workers, you know, the college wage premium stabilized in the 80s and 90s because the wages of, you know, higher skilled workers and more educated workers also began to stagnate in the US. So in the US, like as many people have pointed out, you know, inequality isn't really about a decline in the position of people at the bottom. It's not like the fall in the 10th percentile versus the 50th, which is what a story focused on the experience of, you know, people working in routine automatable tasks would suggest, like the auteur story. It's really that wages have stagnated for like the bottom 80%. And it's really only people in the very top who are seeing wage growth. So it's very hard to explain that in those terms of the experienced people at the bottom. Also, something auteur doesn't talk about is that a lot of the inequality in the US is actually inside of occupational groups, whereas his focus kind of only looks at differences between different occupations because he focuses on task-based automation. And so he doesn't capture the fact that a lot of this is because, you know, we just have such such poor labor market conditions that many people are getting the same jobs as other people, but getting paid a lot less to do that work. So like in the United States, for example, in academia, many people are doing, you know, basically full-time academic labor, but as adjuncts. So they receive much less pay for the same kind of work. And that's been a phenomenon kind of across the US economy. So I think that in many ways, auteur has like focused on the part of the automation story that makes sense, but it sort of doesn't explain very much of the larger phenomenon that people are interested in thinking about. It misses the kind of broader stagnation story. So that's sort of my thoughts about that. But I think it's a really interesting problem. And I think auteur is a really fascinating economic and, you know, innovative economic researcher. And I'll just say about the flexibility thing, I completely agree with what you said about Uber. And in a lot of ways, that's why I focus more on the broader macroeconomic context than on the specificity of the Uber jobs, because I actually think a lot of people, they look at Uber jobs and they compare it to like a good job. They're like, oh, this is a bad job compared to some fictional good job that someone could get. But in reality, many people who are choosing to work in the platform economy are choosing among bad jobs. And, you know, many bad jobs in the service sector have very, very workers. They have flexibility in a different sense. Like their employers only give them their schedules for the next week, like a few days in advance. So people's schedules are subject to constant change. And given that kind of insecurity with regard to when one is able to work, it makes so much sense that many workers choose to be managed by an algorithm and to choose their own working time rather than having them set by their employers. So I think that in a way, a key part of the story you're telling there is really about how a lot of people are choosing, their options are choosing among an available set of bad jobs rather than good ones. And part of why we know that is because in the US, when the labor market finally tightened in 2018, 2019, what we saw is that many fewer people drove Uber. They had a lot of trouble finding workers because, you know, when the economy was growing a little bit more quickly and workers had more options, they were tending to leave because some good jobs were being created. So I totally agree with that analysis. And I think that it's really a story about the bad jobs people are choosing among rather than the idea of a good job that's actually not available to most people who are driving Uber. So thank you again so much for those comments. And I'm really, I appreciate the interventions a lot, and I'm excited to hear the comments from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. So I will read the first question. It's a question in Spanish, so I will translate it. It says, considering Mexico's context, high informality and low productivity and growth, automation could cause a displacement effect of the people with fewer skills towards informal sector. And with this, a circle or loop of greater informality, lower productivity and growth that would not foster the creation of new tasks with a comparative advantage in work. What policies could reduce these effects?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And, I think that what you see from that data is just that, what you really need is a much higher rate of investment, like in the expansion of the capital base to improve workers' productivity. It's really not a story about technologies with very high rates of productivity getting rid of jobs. It's a story about a lack of investment that would improve productivity and also create growth for the people in the economy. And I guess that's part of my concern about, I think that the Mexican economy has faced a very adverse international environment, especially for the last 20 years. Not just with the rise of China, but also with the depression, the lower rates of growth in the US and other kind of export markets for Mexican products. But that is also why it's hard for me to imagine the basic income story working out, because, in the context of slowing growth in Mexico, I think, you'd see the same kinds of demands for austerity and welfare retrenchment that we've already seen over a longer period of time. It's much harder to, basic income is a form of welfare provision. And, in Mexico, they've had conditional cash transfers, and universal basic income would be in a lot of ways better than a conditional cash transfer. But it's hard to imagine that really taking off in the way that in the context of lower economic growth. It seems like, one thing that's really interesting about the moment we're in now, and I don't know what possibilities, what people think about this in Mexico City, is like, it seems like Bidenomics is like changing. In the US, people are like, oh my God, this is really changing possibilities for growth, because maybe we're just going to have public investment, that there's just going to be higher corporate taxes and more direct state spending on, improving people's lives and building infrastructure and stuff like that. I think that it's harder to imagine those kind of changes in, the US has very high debt levels now, but because it has the world's reserve currency, it seems like they don't really have to worry about that. Whereas part of the trend of slowing growth that we've seen is that countries all over the world have already accumulated very high levels of public debt. So it's made the space for that kind of public investment much smaller. So I think it's a very difficult situation. I think it's important to think, I think the times call for radical new ideas. And I think basic income is one of those. Public investment is another. And that's the kind of, we live in a very interesting context where there's a real possibility for changing the way that we think about the sources of economic growth and how to improve people's lives.
Thank you, Aaron. I don't know if Laura would like to add something.
Yes, I completely agree with Aaron on the investment part. No, that we definitely need more investment. And I would also come back to that point of universal insurance, not necessarily income, but universal insurance for certain risks, because that would, by itself, it wouldn't solve the problem. But I think that would complement the investment, the increase of investment as a policy option that Aaron is talking about. Because part of what really worries us about these informality jobs is that people are, these are not only low productivity jobs and precarious jobs, but they are also not, they do not provide the kind of protection against risks that formal productive jobs do. So I definitely believe that by itself, it wouldn't be enough, but I think just cutting that link between the protection that is provided for certain universal risks and the type of job that a worker has could really interact with the investment policy that Aaron is talking about, and then be more effective in breaking that cycle.
Thank you, Laura. And just one comment, and maybe Laura can correct me. I think that the current government in Mexico has dropped all the previous conditional cash transfers. It has replaced them by unconditional cash transfer for certain sectors, like the disabled and the elderly. There's just one, I think, conditional cash transfer, that is this apprenticeship program for young workers who get some cash in return for learning a trade.
For training.
For training. So, but you know, these programs that were put into practice by the previous 3 or 4 governments, now the new government dropped them. So there's a little bit of a change.
Yes, that's right.
So now we have a question from Adriana Alfaro. She's a professor at ITAM in Mexico City. And she says, thanks so much for the presentation. You mentioned that in the book, there are some reflections about possible solutions, given that, in your view, decreased economic growth is rather the most important part of the problem behind the low demand for work. Could you speak a bit about what those solutions look like? And how do they speak to people who problematize the paradigm, between quotation marks, of economic growth, people doing work on growth and environment? Stephen, and she mentions Stephen Masikura, Julie Rose, etc. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I guess I'm one of the people who kind of tries to work on economic questions, but also on, you know, very radical ideas about our future. And I guess I think that you're right to point to those questions, because the ecological crisis in the end is going to be a massive negative to economic growth. You know, we have to think about sustainability and very, very quickly, and that causes big problems for an economy that's based on growth. What I was going to say is that I think, you know, one of the things about the economic statistics we have, like unemployment and GDP growth, is that they tend to make us think that the solution is always, you know, when there's higher rates of unemployment, we have to make the economy grow more in order to fix those problems. But in the course of the 20th century, there were all of these ideas about how to improve people's social stability in ways that aren't so directly connected to the growth rate. And I think Stephen Masikura talks about this a little bit in his book on growth. You know, in the 1970s, I think in Mexico, as well as in many other countries, even before growth rates started to decline, people were pointing out that high growth rates weren't even really solving the problems of poverty, of lack of access to sanitation and clean water in poorer parts of the country. That actually, for solving poverty and meeting people's basic needs, growth was turning out to be a kind of inefficient way to reach those goals, because even high rates of growth were only affecting the very poor to a limited extent. And I think that in that era, it was very interesting, the kinds of proposals that we're talking about now, like unconditional cash transfers, really come from that era as kind of the 1970s, like an era of doubts about the growth project. And that's, of course, also when you get a lot of the kinds of ecological concerns. I think that, you know, if we are facing a slower growing world economy, and if that's tied to these bigger transitions that we're seeing in the rich countries, which provide the markets for a lot of countries around the world, and facing up to the ecological crisis, we should really think about radical solutions to these kinds of problems. I think one thing that's very heartening that's happening right now is that economists like Larry Summers, but also many others, are starting to realize that recommending austerity for 4 decades, recommending that the way to get back to growth was to kind of push people to kind of take away welfare benefits and reduce public investment and kind of push everyone into the market. Because the economy grew more slowly, that actually just made people suffer more, to make them more dependent on market-based incomes at a time when the market wasn't growing as fast was just disastrous for a lot of people. And so I think we live in a moment where ideas about public investment and basic income are on the rise again. And I guess looking back to the 70s, I would just mention that I think more universal provision of goods and services to people. So focusing more on building public housing and building clean energy, and works like Mariana Mazzucato pointing out that a lot of innovative research, both in energy and in computers, came directly from the state. It was public-based research and development, not private. And I just think we're kind of moving into an era where there's more opening towards thinking about sort of non-market solutions, and that especially facing up to the ecological crisis, we really need to find ways to improve people's lives, especially in countries like the United States, to improve people's lives without growth, so that countries that have lower incomes can take the available carbon space to develop. And those kinds of, kind of ecological reparations, I think, are very important. And we're going to start to hear more. We are going to hear more and more talk about that, I think, over time. Sorry if I'm talking a little, rambling a little bit. I should just say that, it's getting to be a little later here in Europe. So it's sort of the end of the day for me, and my brain functions a little less well.
No, don't worry. It doesn't seem like rambling to me, no. Okay. And we have a comment by Zulia Orozco. She only says that she found the presentations very interesting and the data that you provided very impressive. She asks about if she can get the presentation. Well, Zulia, this session is going to be on YouTube, so you can check it later, and you will find there both presentations. Both Aaron's and Laura's presentations will remain there in the video on YouTube. And well, there's a final question by Luis Santiago Ayala, and this question is for both Laura and Aaron. And it's about the recent changes in labor law in Mexico. He says, in the opinion of the participants, how could the recent labor reform in Mexico affect automation? In particular, this aspect of the reform that he says that only allows very specialized activities for outsourcing. So I don't know, Aaron, if you're familiar with the reform, or maybe Laura can tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, Laura, why don't you go first?
To be honest, I must confess I have not been following in detail that debate, the outsourcing. I just know that they want to what the question says, restrict the outsourcing considerably. And then specific activities to only allow it for very specific activities, and then the rest would then be illegal, right? Because it has been a way of employers to kind of not provide workers with benefits, right? To have like cheap labor for some tasks like cleaning, for example, and others, no? And not, not hire those workers with all the full benefits that should be hired. So that's as far as I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the recent changes, if you would like to comment on that or not.
I mean, I don't know about that specifically, but of course, that's a very big problem all around the world, that that companies take jobs that are, take jobs that are formal and have certain benefits, and they kind of, they say we don't need, they dismiss those workers, and then they recreate the jobs as informal work, and that sort of outsourcing. So it's been, it's I think that there's a real, I don't want to sound like a pessimist here, but there's been a very big problem trying to solve these issues with legal regulatory changes, just because oftentimes, no matter how good the laws are, employers often find ways around them, to informalize jobs. So if you have workers who need work and are, and don't have very many options, and employers who, are sort of want to use the lower wage labor, it's been very difficult for countries to actually legally prevent that from happening, which isn't to say that countries shouldn't try to do it. It's really important to try to protect workers' benefits, but in a lot of ways, and I don't know about the Mexican case, so I'm speaking more broadly, improving the conditions of workers in the informal sector in general, rather than trying to protect the higher wage jobs that exist, that you have to kind of do both things, right? You have to improve the conditions for all of the informal workers from the bottom, so that there's less incentive to kind of do that informalization of work. So yeah, that's that, but I don't know about the specific context in Mexico, where I'm sure very local factors play a big role.
Okay, and to end today's session, I would like to ask just a question myself. And Aaron, I've read some other narratives about automation that are very optimistic, and I think they fall within this creative destruction story. So I've read that some people say that yes, automation might destroy some jobs, but the new digital technologies will create a lot more, and this is just will repeat the cycle of creative destruction of capitalist or industrial economy. So what do you think about this take on this more optimistic take on automation?
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, that people want to find some hope for the future in like engineers and technologists. And I also think it should be said that Silicon Valley itself is like putting out a lot of kind of optimistic accounts of what's going on. And I just think that, especially in the US in the last few years, what we've seen is this kind of tech backlash where people are sort of recognizing that a lot of those changes that were promised are sort of not coming around. I really recommend, for those interested in the technology story, I really recommend a book by Gary Marcus that's called Rebooting AI. He himself is a kind of proponent of a certain kind of artificial intelligence research, but the book explains, what is the technology we have, and what are its potentials and limits. And I think even just a few years ago, you would hear people saying, look, these machine learning and deep learning are going to get better and better, and we're going to have autonomous cars, and we're going to have, lawyers are going to go away. All of this work all this drudgery is going to go away. And what Gary Marcus said, and more people are now agreeing with him, is just that the kinds of AI we're developing are actually very limited in terms of their ability to do human jobs. And the idea that many optimists have, that if we just have more and more processing power, the computers will get smarter and smarter. Gary Marcus said it's never going to happen because these computers don't actually think at all. There's no intelligence in the human sense of the term in the machines. They're really just doing statistical analysis. And they never have any causal understanding whatsoever. And that means that there will always be what they call edge cases. There will always be many examples that the machines encounter that they've never seen before, and they will never be able to accurately deal with those cases. And what we've seen in the last few years is more and more people kind of agreeing with this pessimistic account that basically the AI is not improving as much as people thought with the advancing processing power, because there's just limits to how far you can get with this kind of statistical analysis without the machines actually being able to analyze causal relationships. Like if you show a child, you know, an example sometimes given is like if you show a child 5 pictures of an iguana, they start to be really good at identifying that's an iguana, that's not an iguana, that's a different type of lizard. These machines, you have to show them 5 million pictures of an iguana, and then they get it right 95% of the time. So, and even with much more processing power, they're not getting much better at it because the approach itself is fundamentally limited. So I just think that, you know, I'm telling you that like more and more people are saying that, talking about the limits of these machines and why they won't be able to do as much as people are hoping. But I think that in the end, the economic data just doesn't match that story. You know, things would have to really change dramatically in a way that they haven't to break with this stagnation trend. And, you know, just to reiterate that the decade, though, it's supposed to be in the United States, the country with Silicon Valley, all this amazing, you know, companies at the forefront of research and all these questions. The decade that they talked about as being the most advanced decade saw the lowest productivity growth in the post-war era. Just the low rates of investment, very low rates of productivity growth. The changes that were supposed to be there from these technologies just weren't there. What we saw instead, slow growing economy, jobless recoveries, lack of investment. And I just think that that's going to be the overriding story. And technologies, you know, yeah, if anything, it's too little investment, not too much investment in these new technologies. That's the key story. But if you want to see more, I'll just reiterate, if you want to see more of the technology side of it, I really recommend Gary Marcus, Rebooting AI. It's a very good introduction to why you might think about being a technological pessimist. Though I'd love to be an optimist. I say that as a researcher, not for my feeling, you know, like I would love to live in a world like that, especially a world with like robotic childcare and, you know, all of these kinds of things. But it's just, it's at least 100 years away, unfortunately. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. And Aaron was just telling us right before the beginning that his book is going to come out in Spanish later this year, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember the name of the publishing house?
Traficantes, I think.
Traficantes de Sueños, of course, yeah. Okay, so we'll be really looking forward to that. So thanks again, Aaron. Thanks again, Laura, for this session. I think it was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Have learned a lot.
Humberto, can I just add something on the story that you said?
Yes, of course.
So, well, I certainly don't agree with the super optimistic view that they will destroy some jobs and they will create a lot more. No, at least that's how you said it. But I do think that some jobs are going to be destroyed and some new jobs are going to be created. It's not that it's going to be a lot more like to probably, you know, save us, but for sure there will be new jobs being created and then old jobs. But even if that is true, I think something important is that the adjustment costs are not zero in general, right? Like we like to think that even if this super optimistic view would be true, the adjustment of the people who lose their jobs, no, because they have different skills, and the people who are able to take advantage of the new opportunities, I mean, those costs tend to be substantial. At least that's how it has been till now, right? And so in the short or even medium term, there can be like a significant deterioration of the labor market prospects of many workers. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Laura. So thanks again for both of you. And so we'll let you know to the public about the next session in about a month and a half. So please keep in touch on the social networks of El Colegio de México and El Colegio Nacional so that you know the next session's date and time. And thanks again for coming, and hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you,
nice
Aaron.
meeting you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Hasta luego.
Bye.
Okay,
thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was really great to meet you. So yeah, thanks for having me. And I hope, one day we can meet up in
Yeah,
Mexico.
hope we can coincide again, but next time in person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great. Okay,
so
well, if you come back to Mexico again, please let me know. You have my email. It will be great to meet up and talk.
I'm definitely coming back, so I'll let you know.
So of course, please do.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Hasta
Have a good night.
pronto. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.